On the phone is Juan Williams, Fox News political analyst. And Juan, that last remark suggests that local prosecutors, local police, and indeed the jury may have been racist because the outcome, the result would have been different had the alleged victim been white. Now, is the president easing racial tension or stoking racial tension?
Well, his intent is to ease racial tension, but the risk, Greg, that he took by coming out is that he will stoke racial tension because it politicizes this whole tragedy. The minute he speaks out, as he did, if you'll recall, in the Professor Gates affair in Boston, in that case he said he thought the police had acted stupidly. Immediately, left-wing, right-wing locked into positions, and as he described it, there was not very much productive dialogue that came afterwards. I think that's why he says he's not now in favor of that kind of public, airing of this whole complaint. But I just wanted to say, in response to what you said earlier, I'm not sure that he was indicting the jury or the process by saying if Trayvon Martin had been white. I think what he was saying was that he believes that once Zimmerman saw Trayvon Martin was a black kid wearing that hoodie, that it fit a lot of stereotypes of black male youth as suspect and if not criminal, and played into the high number of convictions of blacks for violent crime.
But Juan, Trayvon Martin's own mother said this is not about race. Even the prosecutor in his rebuttal closing argument looked those jurors square in the eye and said this case has nothing to do with race. And yet the president suggested that it does. He went so far as to recommend that local law enforcement needs to be better trained regarding race. Again, isn't he presuming that local law enforcement made decisions based on race, and they insist, as well as prosecutors, they did not?
Well, I disagree. I think that this case was, in terms of the courtroom, not about race. But I don't think there's any doubt that the country right now is locked into this as a racial controversy, Greg. I think it has stirred lots of discomfort, if not outright questions about how we deal with race, about whether or not, even if Trayvon Martin was, stereotyped as a criminal because of the way he was dressed and because he was walking between houses, did it matter then if he had turned around and been a white teenager as opposed to a black teenager? So that's not to say that the case was about race as it was presented to the jury. And the FBI has said there was no evidence that Zimmerman was pursuing a racist agenda. So that's not it.
Well, and the president's second proposal is that we re-examine some of the gun laws. Specifically, the president said the Stand Your Ground law. The president likely doesn't realize that Stand Your Ground had nothing whatsoever to do with the case. It was
Absolutely
a procedural
right.
maneuver that was waived. Retreat was not an issue in the case because Zimmerman said, and there was no other evidence to the contrary, that he had no ability to retreat. And yet the president unknowingly seems to invoke it. And he also seems oblivious to the statistical fact that in Florida, more African Americans avail themselves of that law. But look, overall, Juan, we've seen people take to the streets, mostly African Americans, protesting what went on. Some of those protests and demonstrations became incredibly violent. Doesn't the president now run the risk that he is going to provoke even more demonstrations, and let's hope not, but potential violence?
Well, he said explicitly that these demonstrations that turn violent dishonor Trayvon Martin's memory and his family.
But that may be lost on the people who are now potentially going to take to the streets.
As a matter of politics, I think he said it quite explicitly that that's not acceptable behavior. But to your earlier point about Stand Your Ground, it did have nothing to do with this case. It was not introduced by the defense. It wasn't introduced by the prosecution as an issue. I think that what we're seeing there is Attorney General Holder and President Obama unlikely to be able to find any evidence of racism that would justify a civil case against George Zimmerman on the basis of hate crime legislation, are now trying to focus all the energy, all the upset about this case into repeal of those stand your ground laws. So I think they're trying to direct that energy, and that's a very strong political move for them.
You know, look, he's the president of the United States, a busy man. I doubt he sat there in front of a television and watched the evidence unfold, and yet he's offering a judgment here the same way he did in 2009. You know, in the case of Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor who was arrested, and, you know, the president with racial overtones said that police acted stupidly. Why is the president of the United States weighing in on local criminal matters, Juan?
Oh my gosh, Greg, this is what I said to you at the very start of our conversation this afternoon. The president's taking a tremendous risk by speaking out, because people immediately, in reacting to him and not his words and not his intent, not his call for soul searching and increased consciousness and better sensitivity on racial issues, will take sides based on, oh, President Obama spoke out. But I think that what we're seeing here is that this must have been troubling him on a very deep level, because I don't think any political advisor would say, oh, yeah, Mr. President, we think you should go out there and just go ahead and expend some of your own political capital to do this. They know that there's going to be a lot of blowback for the fact that he spoke out, and people who will say that he not only politicized it, but people who suggest, as you just did, that he might be giving some sustenance to people who are in the streets who might turn violent. So he took a tremendous risk here, but I think that this is something that, you know, speaks to the idea he's our first black president, Greg. He's been under criticism from near and wide for not doing enough in terms of addressing high black unemployment, particularly, I might add, among teenagers and teenage boys, and dealing